To go ahead and get started, I want you all to know that we are going to record this session, and we'll post a link along with the links of the other 3 recorded webinars on the INEE website, and share with you where that is at the end of the session. And we'll have this recorded link to those who are unable to join us today. So to begin by welcoming you to this INEE training on conflict sensitive education. This is Module 8, an 8-module training series that we have developed over the past couple of years. And I'll start with a few words about myself. My name is Cynthia Kuhn. You see Fraser as the host of the session, but that is because Lindsay is the owner of the membership to WebEx. It is actually Cynthia Kuhn that's leading the session, and the Capacity Development Coordinator for Conflict Sensitive Education for INEE, working in support education and conflict affected contexts for a little over a decade for agencies such as UNICEF, Save Children, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, in countries such as Kosovo, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Guatemala, Colombia, Philippines, Nepal, and Haiti, to be offering this session to today. Let me give you a little bit of background about how the training was developed. INEE Interagency Network for Education Emergencies is an open and global network of around 11,000 members for 170 countries. And now the network includes 3 working groups, a Standards Working Group, Education and Fragility Working Group, and an Education Cannot Wait Advocacy Group. And members in these groups have come together to develop resources on this topic of conflict-sensitive education. The conflict-sensitive education training package was developed in 2014 and led by members in the INEE minimum by 55 organizations in different countries, as well as pilots that I led in Liberia and in Harvard. I mentioned it's a full training package, and this presentation is focusing on Module 8, conflict strategies for monitoring and evaluation specifically. So for the session are for you to understand how monitoring and evaluation and conflict interact, to the 3 parts to conflict-sensitive monitoring and evaluation, and in fact to be familiar with one of the tools INEE has created to support conflict sensitivity, and that's the INEE Conflict-Sensitive Education Reflection Tool. So describing a little bit what we're referring to when we say monitoring and evaluation. Evaluation, we're using these terms in a broad sense for this session. We're talking about deciding what to measure, how to measure it, how to collect that information, what steps to take to analyze the information, and of course adapting education program or policy. So the definition of monitoring and evaluation for this session is quite broad and general. Exploring a little bit, how does conflict interact with monitoring and evaluation? And I'll give an example here of something I have encountered. In Guatemala, have staff that speak only Spanish, and they live in the urban center, Guatemala City. There's early childhood education for the Mayan people who live in the mountains and rural areas. Spanish-speaking Ladinos do not allow the Mayans the same civil rights such as birth registration, voting, etc. And it's in conflict between the 2 groups. To establish an early childhood program, the NGO sends their team from the urban center to the mountains to collect first monitoring data on their early childhood development program in the Mayan communities. For yourself, what do you think could happen when Spanish-speaking Latino group arrives in the Mayan community to ask questions about early childhood? The results could be that the people react with fear because of conflict dynamics that have existed between the two groups. Maybe Mayans resist being asked about birth registration, and that triggers these old grievances because of the historical conflict. NGO workers, the Latino Spanish-speaking NGO workers are threatened or attacked or asked to leave the villages. And the other effect on the program could be that no data is collected because of this mistrust between the two populations. So this is an example of how a simple monitoring or evaluation activity of an NGO that is going to collect information on an early childhood program connect with the conflict dynamics, both historical and present, that exist within the community. These dynamics that we want to consider when we're talking about how monitoring and evaluation activities affect conflict. But look at this a little bit more in detail. When to do conflict-sensitive monitoring and evaluation, we want to consider three different parts. We want regular monitoring and evaluation in a conflict-sensitive way. We measure the conflict analysis that we did in the initial program design stage throughout the program cycle to monitor the conflict sensitivity of the education program. So in step one, doing regular monitoring and evaluation in a conflict-sensitive way, we consider who is best to collect the data. How will they be perceived by the different groups and actors in the conflict context? We consider whether doing the assessment would raise expectations for services, which the actor may not be able to deliver on later and could lead to grievances. And two, when we're monitoring the conflict analysis throughout the program cycle, steps like including in every staff meeting a discussion about what has changed among the conflict actors, dynamics, or trends within the education program area. Step three, when we're monitoring the conflict sensitivity of the education program, we want how conflict sensitive were at each step and each action taken to design, implement, monitor, evaluate, and close our program. Talk about in a little bit greater detail how to do regular monitoring and evaluation in a conflict-sensitive way. Doing monitoring of our program's interaction with conflict or doing monitoring for more conventional programming purposes, the way that we do monitoring really matters. Evaluation activities, to some degree, are interventions in and of themselves because we're sending outsiders into a program area and we're interacting with them and talking with them about education, their expectations, education services. So we want to consider these important points. Who is collecting the information? What identity characteristics? What languages are they speaking? Implicit messages might be communicated by the people that we are sending into communities to collect information. For example, if a population where 90% of the population speaks Creole and a smaller portion of the population speaks French, but we always do our data collection on education programming in French. What kind of value messages are we sending to the population that speaks Creole and not French? Are we saying that French is more valued, or the French-speaking actors are more valued than the speakers of Creole? Because of these kind of implicit messages when we're sending people out to do monitoring and evaluation data collection. We consider how could this lead to conflict? Who is included in collecting information? How might this cause intergroup tension? For example, if we are going out to collect monitoring data and only serving egalitarian mandate the population that is displaced or that is living in camps, and we're never collecting information on the education status of the host or nearby communities outside of the camp, creating or adding to the tension between these two groups. We consider who's being asked for our monitoring and evaluation data and who is not being asked. We want to analyze the respondent group, understand who could be excluded or who is being excluded. Certain factions of a group consistently represented in our monitoring and evaluation data and other factions consistently excluded. How might that influence our data for our program? So how might this influence the broader conflict dynamics? Consult beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. This is difficult. In some situations, people may be angry or upset that they're not targeted by an intervention. We still want to reach out to the people who are not the main target, because we need to track these conflict dynamics between groups and need to understand that if delivering education to one group and not another is exacerbating the conflict, we want to change our program design. We also want to consider when to collect our information. Are there times in the conflict cycle or trends that are more volatile than others, for example, around election periods? And we want to avoid trying to collect data during those times. Others might want to avoid national holidays, days that have been set aside for martyrs, and of election results. So we've talked about all of these considerations as they relate to monitoring and evaluation and conflict sensitivity. But when else in the program cycle might we also want to take these considerations in mind during the design and assessment phase part of our program cycle? So let's hear and review the chat box to see if there are any questions that have been able to connect to audio. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Only silence, and I don't see any questions yet in the chat box, so I'll go ahead and continue. So we're still talking about how to do our regular education monitoring and evaluation programming in a conflict-sensitive way. One of the ways we might do this is to ensure that we collect both quantitative and qualitative information. Consider when we're deciding what types of information to collect, is information that's off limits, may trigger violence. For if we're collecting monitoring data in Rakhine State in Myanmar, there might be certain labels for the displaced population that we don't want to use because it might trigger reaction or violence in our data collection. So always ask, what appropriate language? What's the information that may be off limits because it could trigger conflict? Do different groups perceive types of information in different ways? Some communities, for example, may be very politically sensitive to talk education for girls and the right to education for girls. So we learn and understand communities' perception of these types of topics before we send outsiders in to collect monitoring and evaluation data. It includes quantitative and qualitative information because quantitative indicators are very useful to understand the interaction between the program and conflict and our program implementation, regarding what we expect to happen. But there are going to be dynamics that are happening in the society that we maybe don't expect. And the way that we can discuss those types of dynamics is through open-ended questions or qualitative information. What we don't know, we want to look beyond the quantifiable information and use qualitative methodology. Qualitative information can assess the unintended consequences of program on conflict through open-ended questions. Qualitative information can help us explore people's attitudes and feelings about a program or policy. And this is especially important in conflict sensitivity. Perceptions can be motivational for violence as facts. One more time, because this is very important with conflict-sensitive approach to monitoring and evaluation. Perceptions can be as motivational as violence as facts. I want to make sure to be asking open-ended questions to a very diverse audience through data collectors that speak the different languages, that understand the different contexts, so we understand the variety of perceptions that exist, that we're not playing into perceptions that may contribute to conflict. So it really helps to understand about unanticipated and unintended consequences of our programming. More specifically about this, here's a table that shows some quantitative indicators for conflict sensitivity. The question might be, what is the level of tension between refugee and host community over education services? And a good indicator may be number of incidents of violence between host and refugee communities, or who report tension with the group in the target area. Information can certainly be useful, but we want to expand it by also asking some qualitative questions. Qualitative question that you might also want to include a survey to address this overall topic of level of tension between refugee and host community for education services. I want to ask, how have the education services, or maybe specifically this temporary learning space area, a relationship between the refugee and host community? Or has already been some conflict, we might want to ask, why has the temporary learning space contributed to rising tensions between these two groups? Summary. A quantitative approach to monitoring and evaluation of program monitoring needs to include both quantitative and qualitative methodologies and data collection, because we want to understand the perceptions that exist about how our education programming is relating to conflict. Familiar terms to you. We also want to always include triangulation, disaggregation, and validation in monitoring and evaluation of education programs. Separating information according to different characteristics in order to see underlying inequities that may be masked by the aggregate data. And I'll give you a specific example of that in just a minute. Is comparing information gathered across different sources. Validation is presenting information that we've collected to people with the context or issues in order to elicit their feedback on whether what we've collected or our understanding of the data is accurate. Why might these three be especially important in a sensitive approach? Well, as we were just discussing, for triangulation, we want to share information across different data sources because there are such a variety of perceptions, and perceptions really matter. It can be as great a cause for conflict as actual facts. We want to be comparing the monitoring data that we're collecting across sources. So disaggregate, we want to separate the education information we have according to different characteristics. Make sure that the averages, which is a data point that we use very often, are masking big discrepancies. For example, an average of the group of students that we are serving could mask a discrepancy of one population that's not being served at all with another population that's being served completely. And make sure sure that we're delivering, that we understand who's being served and who's not being served by disaggregating our data by different gender and identity group characteristics. We, of course, want to validate our information because it's very complex and very difficult for an outsider to come into a context and understand fully the reasons or dynamics of causes of conflict in a certain area. We want what we found to a community that's familiar with it to elicit their feedback. So to give you a specific example of disaggregation, the table of the percentage of primary school age children in the Democratic Republic of Congo that have never been to primary school. You can see at the top, the age is about 17%. As you disaggregate that data point, for example, by region, Katanga versus Kinshasa, the major city, or versus richest, 17% average masks a great discrepancy between the females, the poor females living in Katanga, females living in Kinshasa. And this is so important, disaggregation is so important for conflict sensitivity because it can help us to identify populations that have been marginalized without access to services such as education. And there we have grievances that could erupt in conflict if not addressed. And as actors, we want to make sure that we don't exacerbate those grievances. So let's to the second step. We want to monitor the conflict analysis throughout the program cycle. Conflict analysis alive and real throughout the program because conflict is so dynamic. We know that contexts are constantly evolving, the power and economic structures are constantly shifting as society moves in and out of the conflict phases. Modules 2 and 3 of the larger training package, we spend quite a bit of time discussing how to do a mini conflict analysis and how to analyze the interaction between education programs and the conflict context in detail. Well, with this slide is that it's not sufficient to do that analysis at the beginning of the program only, but we need to keep that type of analysis live and real throughout the program cycle. It needs to be an ongoing process until the program has completed to do, say, a formal evaluation. We want to ensure that we're doing program design adjustments throughout the program cycle, and we need real-time feedback. So we can keep our conflict analysis alive and real by doing simple things, like in our program planning meeting or an education cluster meeting or a local education working group meeting. We can simply be asking questions or standing item on the agenda, such as how have the tensions in the education program area changed? How the situation of the targeted beneficiaries changed within the conflict? Any new actors? Are there any new dynamics that should be explored? And then most importantly, how should we change the design of our program to address some of these changes? We'll start with a pilot of our education program and then look to expand it to a broader population or to a new geographic area. We are doing this type of expansion during our program cycle. It's especially critical for us to be updating our conflict analysis during that process, asking questions like, will this phase of this program require a new analysis and collection of information from new informants and new populations in order for us to fully understand the conflict dynamics before we go in with an education program. Third step is to monitor the conflict sensitivity of the education program. The conflict sensitive education packet includes 3 tools, one of which is the reflection tool. You can see links to this tool at the top of the slide. You're welcome to download it and for use with your agency. And I'll just briefly walk us through what the tool is and how it can be used to be more familiar with it. Education actors can use the reflection tool to inform design or to track progress during implementation or make adjustments during the program according to changes in context. And presenting the tool be used to measure conflict sensitivity of a program at the end of a project or maybe even the midterm evaluation. So one of the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Reflection Tool includes subheadings of the program cycle, which you can see there in gray, assessment and conflict analysis. By corresponding reflections. For example, the first set of questions, 1.1 through 1.3, help you determine whether your conflict analysis was good enough. And 1.6, 2.1, and 2.2 are broad checks on whether you have linked your conflict analysis to your program design. This here is, of course, only showing you a few of the questions. The tool is much longer. Two is a space to fill your answers to question 1 and note where there are gaps in your information, what more information is needed. Note what your program is currently doing to address this issue, and what it is currently conflict sensitive, or whether you want to pursue some activities to make your program more conflict sensitive. And 3, as you can see, it says follow-up and resources there on the slide, is where you make your action plan for next steps. What would you improve your program? How could you change your program? And it includes subheadings in gray that are the relevant sections of the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education. Note the tool and the 3 tools of the Conflict Sensitive Education Act. And it is according to the 5 domains of the INEE minimum standard. In this third column, you can see for assessment and conflict analysis series of questions, you can conflict sensitive strategies suggested in the Foundational Standards domain, the Community Participation Standard 1 on participation, or the Analysis Standard 1 on assessment, and several others. So that process, the first step is column 1, reflecting on your current program. The second step is answering those questions and identifying gaps in information. And the third step is the third column, and that's where you can research conflict-sensitive strategies to improve your program and commit to an action plan. It's really important to note that the conflict-sensitive education reflection tool that's presented here does not substitute for conflict analysis. It's a monitoring tool that can assess how conflict-sensitive your program is and your program activities are at each stage of the program cycle. So it doesn't get into details of conflict analysis such as the actors, dynamics, and profile. So because I've mentioned these tools several times, here you can see an illustration of the 3 tools in INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack. The just reviewed for you is listed there at the bottom, the reflection tool. The guidance note is a small booklet, and I mentioned that briefly. And there's a single-page poster, the INEE Guiding Principles for Conflict Sensitive Education. And this is really the one-stop snapshot of what INEE is talking about when we're talking about conflict sensitive education. And you can use guiding principles to raise awareness or to adopt the standards of practice or to commit to in fundraising proposals or to ask applicants to commit to in their proposal to you as the donor. This is just an overview summary. In the normal training delivery, we would have a much longer session now that would allow us time to apply the reflection tool to an existing program that we're working on. Because this is a webinar format, we don't have that opportunity, but there are plenty of resources for you to explore this topic in greater depth. And here are just a few of them that I found particularly useful when I was putting together the training session. And at the bottom, the link to the Conflict Sensitive Education Pack tool, where you can download the reflection tool. If you decide to download that tool and apply it to your program and you come up with any questions, feel free to email me, and I will write my email address here in the chat box for the session right now. So we'll here and see if there are any questions in the chat box. And also, if you have called in and you would like to unmute your line and ask a question, this is the time to do so. You can put in the chat box or unmute your line.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I have a couple of questions. We talked about the type of information and the perceptions of relationship between education components and the conflict. Could you give us an example?
Let me just go to that slide. Did you follow your questions and I'll write them down?
Okay. About open-ended questions, would you mention names of NGOs or of education providers to the people you're interviewing? Or, keep it neutral, if that's possible.
Okay.
And moving on to changes and dynamics of, conflict, shifting and so on. Often would you adapt to changes of conflict, and do you go to the same informants? Because that's quite tricky.
Yep.
And who usually leads the conflict cases? Is it someone from the same agency as our agency, or is it someone external? That's all from me. And I noticed that you missed out a letter in your email address, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you.
With double E, just in case people want to write to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Emmeline, I've rewritten my email address. I had missed an E in INEE site. So please see corrected email there. And let's go through some of these great questions. Okay, so first question was, can you give an example of a qualitative question that you might ask? So just review this slide because it gives some examples of types of questions that you could ask. You could use quotations, so you could use questions about perceptions of relationship between education and conflict, perceptions of conflict dynamics, attitudes towards the implementing agency, other actors, or unexpected consequences. Let's think of some specific examples here. If we wanted to address, for example, or investigate what were the attitudes of the beneficiary group toward implementing agency, we could ask a contemporary appropriate version of the question, how is this NGO perceived by the community? Is this NGO perceived? That would be a closed question, but we could say the open question, how is this NGO perceived by the community? If we were to ask of the relationship between education components and the conflict, we could ask how was the process of teacher recruitment and selection perceived by the community, and we could ask that to members on each side of the conflict, each side of the conflict dynamic in that area. Let's see, if we move to the other side, that might give us a few more ideas as well. Here. So I gave us the example of some quantitative questions, and I gave a couple examples of how to supplement these quantitative indicators with qualitative questions. For example, in the first one, what is the level of tension between refugee and host community over education services? You could simplify and ask a version of that very question. You could how the delivery of the temporary learning space has affected relationships between the refugee and host community? That would be a qualitative, open-ended question. Moving down to the next line, school construction. This is often the source of conflict between communities, especially if there are disputes about land rights. So ask, how has school construction affected relationships between one group over another? Again, these simple and specific to the context in order to get quality answers to them. But those are a couple of examples of qualitative questions. And then let's see, the second question you asked was, should you mention education provider when doing your monitoring and evaluation data collection? Referring to, but often when we go to do monitoring and evaluation collection, we drive up in a car that's branded with our agency, and staff are required to wear their branded materials, so the community already is aware of who is collecting the information. In some conflict contexts, certain agencies have made the decision to be unbranded because certain actors are already targeted for violence. And so in those cases, they may or may not choose to identify their agency, but in all cases, just of conflict sensitivity, due diligence for monitoring and evaluation is because of who you are and why collecting that information. And that's important to start any process, any monitoring and evaluation process with that step, because information is so politicized in conflict environments. So I think who the education providers are is often already known by the community, and how you express that and how you inform the community members about that, the programming agency's identity and activities should be done in a conflict-sensitive way. The question was, what's the changes, and so how often do you adjust your program to the conflict dynamics? A tricky question to answer, and there's certainly no one right answer for all contexts. I can, in some very volatile, very dynamic contexts, I know agencies would have a weekly meeting on how the conflict actors and dynamics have changed and how they needed to change their education program and service delivery. In other contexts that are more protracted, and for example, in some of the camps that have existed for decades, they may not be doing weekly analysis updates. They might be doing something monthly. So it really depends on the type of conflict. And the secondary question to that was, do you go back to the same informants for information? That's also very contextually dependent. If there's a lot of mobility in the population and a lot of movement, then it's probably unlikely that you could go back to the same informants and include the people in the focus groups, for example. But in some cases that might be possible. So in all cases, whoever you're asking, you want to make sure that that group is diverse and is reflecting not only the leadership that is within that community, but also the populations that are consistently marginalized, and to collect information from the variety of perceptions of actors. And that will help us to get a more in-depth assess the conflict in our education program's relation with it. And the question was, who leads a conflict analysis? The variety of approaches to this and a variety of opinions. Some will opine that the conflict analysis should always be done by an external agent because they are minimally affected by the local biases and could maybe be the most objective. Say that the conflict analysis should always be done by local actors because they do have such in-depth knowledge of the nuances of the conflict, and also it helps build their capacity to be able to analyze the conflict ongoing throughout the program cycle. And a point that we cover in the conflict analysis training module is that the process of conflict analysis can be as productive as the program. for which you're doing the conflict analysis, because it's an opportunity to bring people together from different sides of the conflict to develop shared understanding of the conflict dynamics and a shared commitment to providing education throughout the conflict. I hope I answered your questions. Does anyone else have a question they would like to write into the chat box or ask via audio? Okay, much for your attendance to this session. You can see again my email in the chat box. Feel free to follow up with any questions. In the final, you can see the links to the Conflict Sensitive Education training package, as well as Conflict Sensitive Education pack of 3 tools, which includes the reflection tool that we briefly discussed today. Thank you, and be in touch.